Here's a brief framework for responding to out-of-hospital medical emergencies. There are really only 6 steps you need to remember to respond to an out-of-hospital emergency, and 3 of these steps are just managing the ABCs. EMTs are always taught that the most important step to responding to an emergency is keeping yourself safe. This begins with ensuring that the scene is safe. Of all the on-scene hazards, traffic scares me the most. I've been to several calls where paramedics have been nearly hit by cars, and all that saved them was that the car ran into a parked fire engine rather than into them. It is important to be highly vigilant for oncoming traffic if you stop to help out at the scene of a car accident, particularly if you're on a road where cars are traveling at high speed. If you're in your car and you come across a car accident, consider blocking the scene with your car, much like how the fire engine in this picture is blocking the roadway. It's also important to be aware for violence. Whether committed by patients or bystanders, just keep an eye open and keep aware of what's going on around you. If hazardous materials are present, don't approach the scene, evacuate the area, and prevent others from entering the scene. While hazardous materials may seem like something that is very obvious that you'll of course recognize, like this barrel leaking some sketchy fluid, they can also be more subtle. For example, if there are multiple people in a subway station who are salivating, lacrimating, urinating, defecating, and have bronchospasm and bradycardia, you should be concerned about a nerve agent and just stay away. Another part of protecting yourself is wearing appropriate personal protective equipment. If available, put on gloves, and if you're going to give mouth-to-mouth respirations, consider using a CPR shield. Okay, so now you've protected yourself and you're safe. So now approach the patient. If the patient is responsive, that's great, but if the patient is unresponsive, go through what EMTs call AVPU. First, see if the patient will respond to verbal stimulus. Do what this guy in the picture is doing and be like, "Hey, are you okay?" Then apply a painful stimulus like a sternal rub. Along with checking responsiveness, you should also at this stage be considering whether or not the patient has had a traumatic mechanism like a fall, or being struck by a car, or being involved in a car accident. If there's any concern for significant trauma, get someone to hold C-spine like the paramedic in this picture, and don't move the patient until EMS arrives. The exception to that rule is if the patient is in immediate danger, like if a bomb is about to go off, or if there's a fire near the patient, or something like that. Alright, so now let's go through the ABCs. The first step is airway. Now, if the patient can talk, they have an airway, and there's no immediate need for intervention. But if the patient is unresponsive, then it's important to do something to maintain the airway. So initially, you should position the airway with either the jaw thrust, which is a great maneuver to perform if you have any concern for C-spine injury because it doesn't involve moving the neck, or using the head tilt chin lift maneuver. And these should both be somewhat familiar from taking CPR classes in the past. Now, oral and nasal airways, which are shown here, are kind of an underappreciated adjunct for maintaining the airway. They're often available in first aid kits. They come in a variety of sizes for patients of all sorts of different sizes, and they're easy to place. Now, oral airways can only be placed on patients who do not have a gag reflex, but nasal airways can be placed in a patient with a gag reflex. And don't place a nasal airway if you have any concern for a basilar skull fracture. Now that the airway has been managed, we can turn our attention to breathing. Evaluate for work of breathing and the respiratory rate. If respirations are absent or inadequate, like if a person has had an opioid overdose and has markedly slowed respiratory rate, you can perform rescue breathing or administer BVM ventilations like these paramedics are doing if a BVM is available. So we've done airway and breathing, and now we do circulation. First, check for a pulse. If there's no pulse, then perform chest compressions. And remember that AEDs are available in most public buildings, so if you come across someone in cardiac arrest in public, get someone else who's around to go look for an AED and bring it to you. There's a second important step to evaluating circulation, and that's to check for bleeding. If there's hemorrhage from a compressible source, like bleeding from an extremity, then apply direct pressure. If a tourniquet is available, apply it if you can't control the bleeding with pressure alone. And remember that bleeding control kits are starting to be placed in public areas, often alongside an AED. And these bleeding control kits contain all sorts of items that are helpful for controlling bleeding, like tourniquets. So if you come across someone with massive bleeding, remember to go send someone to see if there's a bleeding control kit around and have them bring it to you. Alright, by this point you've stabilized the ABCs, and it's time to call for help. This just involves calling 911, and some friendly EMTs and paramedics and maybe firefighters and police officers will show up in ambulances, and police cars and fire engines. Alright, so in summary, the ABCs are just a framework of thinking about different steps you should take to evaluate and treat a patient. So for airway, the airway is considered patent if the patient's able to talk, and if they're not able to talk, listen for snoring respirations and look for blood or secretions or foreign objects in the airway. And once you're done assessing the airway, there are different things you can do to treat it. So open the airway using the jaw thrust or head tilt chin lift maneuvers, and then consider placing an airway adjunct like an OPA or an NPA. For breathing, evaluate the respiratory rate and work of breathing. And you should also consider checking for injuries that could affect breathing, like a pneumothorax or flail chest. And then apply different treatments based on your assessment, like assisting ventilations with rescue breathing or by performing BVM ventilations. For circulation, check for pulse. If no pulse, start CPR and send someone to get an AED. Then, check for major hemorrhage. If there is bleeding that you can control it by applying direct pressure or a tourniquet. And that's it. That's all you need to know for initially responding to an out-of-hospital emergency.